All right, if you get to the end of the month and you wonder where are all my MSP profits, it might be time to start looking into agreement gross profit. So many MSPs struggle to see profitability in their net profit, gross profit, service profit, whichever margin you're looking at. And they think more sales is going to solve the problem when it could make the problem worse if you have an agreement issue. So we're going to dig into agreement gross profit and give you some tips to become a master tomorrow so you can quickly and efficiently turn the ship and get to profitability. Right, agreement gross profit is one of the more important metrics that we use in an MSP because it's going to tell us if our agreements are priced properly for the amount of effort and tools that we put into them. And all this metric is going to tell us is just the margin on that service itself. So a couple key points of agreement gross profit is we typically target 65% margin. So for every dollar that we bring in revenue, we can spend 35 cents of that on labor and tools for the agreement specifically. And the formula is very straightforward. We have agreement price, and then we have to subtract the tools cost, what you actually pay for them, the loaded labor rate, and then divide that by the agreement price again to get that percentage. And in our example here, we have a $3,000 agreements, $300 in tools, and $545 in labor costs. We've divided that again by 3,000 to get a 71.8% margin, which is excellent. Now, a couple of challenges with agreement gross profit is that you have to have great calculation and information or it's just not going to work. When we think of pricing, that's going to be how much we charge the client. So if we're not updating our pricing, consistently doing true ups, making sure that the current service level matches the current pricing, we could have a problem with our AGP. Basically, if you don't true up your accounts on a monthly or quarterly basis, you're going to end up losing money if that client grows and you're spending more in both tools and labor to support the client, but you're not receiving any more revenue. Second is the tools cost. We have to make sure everything that is associated with that agreement is built into the contract so that you can run that profitability. So if you've added MDR, some other solution into the stack, we have to make sure the exact amount you pay for it is built into that calculation. And that the counts are right here again, because if we have the counts wrong, we're going to typically see a higher than expected agreement gross profit, making us not do things that we need to do to fix the problem. And last is that labor cost. It's a really important piece of that and typically the most expensive part of any agreement. We want to make sure each employee has a loaded labor rate associated with them. This is going to be different than the W-2 divided by 2080. We have to add in our cost to have that person in the seat. An easy calculation here is just to take that W-2, multiply it by 1.25, a 25% increase, and then divide that by 2080 to get that loaded labor rate. You can also do the long form calculation and understand all the benefits and costs for that person and do the calculation there. But a lot of times the 1.25x times the W-2 divided by 2080 will tell the story for you. So once we have our target of 65%, we have our formula that we're going to use to get that measurement, and then we have all of our inputs right, it's time to start unpacking whether agreements are profitable or not. Now the easy story here is if you're using ConnectWise RMM, you have the agreement gross profit report, which really helps simplify this process. Most PSAs have some sort of calculation or report around this. ConnectWise just makes it easy. So you can run that agreement gross profit to find out where you're at. But we're going to dig into the pricing side of this just so you can see how to set the floor on pricing really quick with your agreements to ensure profitability in most cases. So in this example, you'll see we're doing a user server BCDR solution. Now, however you cut up your agreements, whether you do a holistic number or you do per node or some kind of combination between, it's all the same. We need to understand the tools that go with each account that we use and the labor that goes with each account that we use. And in our accounts here, we're using user servers and then BCDR per server. So you'll see each of these items have some sort of tools with them, with MDR being on the servers and users, and then software, storage, and then co-managed option being on the BCDR side of things. Now, whatever your stack is, you just have to get the cost in there that you pay for that line item and add that up. So we have our total tools cost. Now, I know there's a lot of software out there that isn't this easy to do a one-to-one. We may have some sort of security awareness training that is per company, not per user. We just have to assign a number to that cost that at least covers the cost of that agreement. So as an example, if it's $50 a month for a company and they have 100 users, I might throw 50 cents. I might even throw $1 in there just to make sure I have plenty of room where I won't get an AGP problem with that cost. So now once we have all the costs associated with the agreement, it's time to look at labor. Now, when we're building this price, we have to make an estimate of which team member is going to work on what type of issues. So in this agreement, we're going to assume our technicians are working on user issues and our engineers are working on server and BCDR issues. So we have a different loaded labor rate for each of those situations. We're also going to use some information from our PSA to understand on average how much time do we spend in each of these categories per month. So in this example, on average, we spend 3/4 of an hour on users, we spend an hour on servers, and then a really small period of time on BCDR because we have that co-managed option. And that's going to give us our total labor cost. Now, once we know our tools cost and our labor's cost, we can figure out the total cost for each of these items. We can apply our 65% margin to that cost to get our floor pricing. Now, this isn't what you're going to charge. This means if everything went perfectly up to plan with all of the numbers we have in here, this number would get a 65% margin. So we typically want to add between 10 and 15, maybe 20% to this number to give us a little bit of a buffer because we're not always perfect with our agreements and clients. We want to make sure that at worst case, we're making 65%, not at best case. So now that you get your pricing down and your targets and you understand the three things that go into giving you an accurate agreement gross profit, which are tools, labor, and pricing, it's time to dig into a couple agreements and see what we can figure out. Now, when we look at the agreement gross profit report, and a side tip, if you're using ConnectWise PSA, you can just go to your financial reports, select agreement gross profit, and see this specific information right out of the gate. But as we dig into these, first things first, I'm going to scroll all the way to the right in this specific example, or all the way to the bottom in the agreement gross profit report in PSA, and look at that holistic number to say, hey, holistically, am I above or below my target of 65%? And you can see in this agreement, we're right on. So our initial gut reaction is we're good, let's move on. But we really have to dig into each agreement because like we said, 65% is the minimum target, not the maximum target. So we want to look for areas where it's pulling us down. Now with our first client, we have three different agreements, MSP, BCDR, and VoIP. And in all of these, we can see we're hitting in the mid to upper 70s in our agreement gross profit. So our gut reaction to this is pretty good. Now I'm going to quickly scan and look at the tools and labor versus the price because in most cases, now yours could be different, in most cases, tools are somewhere between 10 and 15% of the total price. And then labor makes up the additional roughly 20% if we're hitting 65%. So I want to make sure we're in line with those general guidelines. And if so, we're going to say this is a good agreement for that month. Now, when we dig into client 2, we'll see we have a couple of challenges, and one we haven't talked about yet. 65% is the minimum, but when you go above 85% in your agreement gross profit, you want to check for two things. One, that we have a good calculation, that we have the right information going in, and are we doing everything that we've promised for this client? If we don't put a couple hours against an agreement, it's going to make that agreement look more profitable, even if we were supposed to do it. So client satisfaction will come into the overall long-term review. But in here, we just want to keep an eye on it to make sure we're still putting the right amount of labor in that's expected for that agreement size. So in these two agreements, you'll see the BCDR agreement is low on its AGP and the MSP agreement is high on its AGP. And if we look at the two numbers, we're going to say, hey, I have a lot of labor in my BCDR agreement, but almost no labor in my MSP agreement. So I need to unpack this. I need to look further into the past to understand where we've been historically on profitability. And then I'm probably going to have to dig into those agreements and find out what the time entries look like under each of those agreements. So in a second, we're going to pull up a quarterly view of these to see if things changed over time. But let's jump to client 3 real quick. And we'll see here we have a problem with our MSP agreement, but the BCDR and VoIP look pretty good. So taking a quick scan of this one, we'll see that the tools costs are relatively high for this agreement size. So this tells me out of the gate, if this is consistent, I'm going to have a very tough time hitting 65% on this agreement if tools cost is 30% of the agreement. Now, this could be a one-off agreement or something different in this solution that we decided to do for that margin. But at the end of the day, we're going to know that that 52% agreement gross profit is going to pull us down. And if it's a product that should have been sold separately, we might have been much better off breaking that out and sticking to our standard managed service agreement so we could have measurements across the board that we can be consistent with. Now again, if we look at this holistically, we're going to think, hey, we're doing pretty good, but we do have a few agreements that we need to dig into. And the best part about this is once you do this process a few times, you typically don't have to do it all the time. Because once we fix issues, whether it's labor, tools, or pricing, we typically fix them long term. So the hard work's in the beginning, and then it gets easier and easier as you do this more and more often. So knowing we have a couple problems, let's dig into a quarterly view. So in the quarterly view, we can see client 1 is still doing great. They're sitting mid-70s for all of their agreements. We're very happy with the profitability on that. We're putting accurate time in there and we have good tools costs. Client 2 still has that consistent problem where we're not putting much labor against the MSP agreement and we're putting a lot of labor against the BCDR agreement. So I'm probably going to dig into see which is the default agreement for this client. Are people just putting time into the wrong agreement, or do we have a real problem with this that we need to fix? And I'm not going to know that until I dig into the tickets and the client in a little more detail. And in the last one, we'll see, yep, those tool costs are consistent throughout the quarter. We're going to have a trouble hitting that 65%. It's going to be almost impossible to hit that with 30% cost on the tool side of things. But at least we see this is consistent, and now we can dig into, do I adjust this agreement? Do I break out a product? Or do I just need to increase my pricing to fit the margins that we're looking for? And that's it. Agreement gross profit is an amazing metric. And by default, just itself, a lot of times can tell the holistic profitability story of an MSP. If you have great agreement gross profit, things that you do are being properly compensated. You can still screw up in a lot of other areas, but at the end of the day, you're selling things that are profitable, and that's a huge step in an MSP. And oftentimes we won't know this, or we won't dial it in perfectly or very well until we take the time to really dig into that agreement gross profit, set a target, understand the formula, and review these on a monthly, quarterly, and annual basis to ensure long-term profitability with these agreements. I'm Jim Peterson, Principal Solution Advisor at ConnectWise, and agreement gross profit is at the heart of an MSP. So we are here to help you figure this out and also figure out how to fix any challenges you have, so hit us up. And until next time, thank you very much for watching.